Pleasure is not a luxury, it is information. And reclaiming pleasure. Reclaiming pleasure is not about indulgence. It's about the body saying, my aliveness matters and I get to feel this. Welcome to the Intimate Philosopher, where philosophy meets intimacy and life's biggest questions finally feel at home. I'm Dr. Emma Smith. I'm a licensed professional counselor, certified sex therapist, and existential philosophy nerd, inviting you to join me for an after-hours conversation. This is a space to slow down, pour a glass of wine, or maybe a cup of tea, and explore the messy, beautiful intersections of meaning, connection, desire, and being fully human. This is the place for real conversations about the parts of life that don't fit neatly into a box. So, grab your glass, get comfy, and let's dive in. Your body remembers what your mind tries to forget. Maybe you've experienced a quickened heartbeat when someone's tone shifts, or you've felt this instinct to pull back from a room because something happened and suddenly it doesn't feel safe. Or maybe on the more positive side, there's the way that your skin warms when you're seen by someone special and not just looked at. Our minds tell us all of these incredible stories, but our bodies are actually the archives of sensation. And for so many of us, unfortunately, the body has become a battleground, and it becomes this place that is more about control or performance instead of pleasure and intuition and home, really. So today, I want to talk to you about what it means to come back home to the body and not as an object to fix. Right? So many people want to know how to fix things. I want to talk to you today about your body as this living and breathing archive of memory and pleasure and, dare I say, truth. So let's kind of set the framing of this. As a therapist, I work with people who live truly brilliant and ambitious lives. These are people who are thoughtful and capable and, for the most part, deeply self-aware, and yet they often feel disconnected from the very body that is carrying them through this incredible life. And in the therapy world right now, there's a really strong emphasis on somatic work and anchoring into sensation, inhabiting the body, and what you may have heard is dropping in. And for many people, that's really transformative, and that's great. But for others, it doesn't feel grounding at all. In fact, it can feel intrusive and even threatening. So if that's you, if the idea of being in your body has ever felt overwhelming or exposing or unsafe, this episode is for you. And not because you're resistant and not because you're doing it wrong or, I don't know, whatever else. But really what it is it's about creating space for this understanding that not everyone is going to enter healing through the same doorway. And they shouldn't have to. And don't get me wrong, I'm not here to argue with somatic work. Far from it. I'm also not here to replace it, and I'm not here to diminish it. I'm really here to widen the frame and to make room for some nervous systems that have learned to survive by not feeling everything all at once. And to say to those people, this isn't a failure. This is an adaptation. So, you may have had friends, I know that I have, who have gone for some sort of somatic therapy. Maybe it's EMDR, maybe it's somatic experiencing therapy, maybe it's something else. And they come back and they're just like, oh my gosh, this was so amazing. It was so empowering. It was lovely. It was good. It was healing. And maybe you went to go try it and you were like, no, it was not good for you. This episode is for you because we're really going to talk about what might be going on and kind of start to set the stage for okay, how do we take care of you? And believe me, you're in good company. I'll share some things as we go on here. And hopefully at the end, you will feel at least like you had a deeper understanding of some of the different ways that people can experience healing or express their desire to heal, and we'll go from there. So maybe you can recognize this feeling, the constant hum of tension, the moving through pleasure on autopilot, maybe trying to figure it out with your head, what I call brain in a jar syndrome, rather than letting yourself feel. I know that this is true for me. For most of my life, I was deeply disconnected from my body, and not necessarily because I hated it, but because I trusted it, actually. I mean, if you think about it, like, I trusted my body to function without my attention for the most part. I was an athlete. I grew up in competitive athletics. I played tennis and field hockey and I skied. And the body really was something to train and discipline and push. And you did focus on your body at first when you were learning these different techniques or where and how to put your body in space in certain shapes and at a certain time to be able to produce the result that you wanted. But after that, it was almost as if that became rote memory. And then a lot of the emphasis was about keeping your mind in check and making sure that your mind didn't get in the way of what your body knew how to do. And so what ended up happening is that the only time I ended up really listening to my body is when something went wrong. So for example, a snapped tendon, when I broke my wrist, I was paying attention to my body. And what I ended up learning inadvertently was that pain earned attention and everything else was kind of background noise. And this isn't even just true for me. I saw this and I see this in so many of my clients who happen to be, classically trained dancers or gymnasts or tactical athletes, military personnel, people who learned very skillfully how to override physical discomfort in the name of performance or duty or even survival. One client I worked with casually mentioned once upon a time that you could suppress your coughing reflex. And I was like, wait a second, you can suppress a reflex. That doesn't seem right. And, that was actually important to that person's job. So, when people like that are suddenly told to, drop into their body and listen and feel, those bodies that have been trained that way, they're not going to sigh with relief. They may end up bracing because for so many folks, our bodies haven't learned that sensation can equal safety. And once they do drop in, what exactly are we listening for? So here's the thing. The body, it doesn't speak in logic and it doesn't explain itself in nice, neat sentences the way that the brain does. It speaks in sensation, in tightness, warmth, breath, pulse. So when we finally do slow down enough to listen, the question isn't what's wrong with me or what's going on with me or why doesn't this make sense? The question really has to be, what has my body been carrying all of this time and what's ready to go? And when we listen gently, when we can listen gently and on our own terms in safety, I think that something really can start to shift that's really important. That's not going to come by accident. And so that's a lot of what we're going to explore today. Okay, so before we go deeper, I do want to pause for a moment. If this conversation feels familiar, and if you're someone who likes thinking about things deeply and craves that depth and connection and really doesn't have time for performative answers, I write a bi-monthly newsletter called The Inner Circle, and it is for people who want less noise and who also want more honesty about intimacy and, yes, embodiment and meaning and purpose and pleasure and desire. And I want you to think about it like it's a glass of red wine for your inbox. So if that interests you, you can join at soliloquy.co/vault. That's SOLILOQUIE.co/vault, VAULT. Or you can find the link in my Instagram bio at Emma Smith PhD, or you can look in the show notes and it will be there for you. So, okay, now that I have made my pitch for my, inbox glass of red wine, let's get back to all about the body. So, in order to kind of frame this, we really have to talk about the body as an archive. Every sensation tells a story, and the body will hold on to each chapter, even the ones that our minds kind of want to skim past. That might be grief that hasn't been released, pleasure and desire that maybe have been suppressed or unexplored, and feelings of safety that maybe we've never actually allowed ourselves to trust and lean into. Some of you know that I started my career in the trauma world, and part of my work there was helping people cope with things like intrusive thoughts, nightmares, memories that really upended my clients' ability to live their lives, not their best lives, just their lives in general. But the truth is that trauma doesn't just live in memories. It can live in things like posture and tone and digestion, and absolutely it can live in sexual desire. And so we often talk about trauma as something that lives in our memories and is framed as the story that we tell, the moment we recall, this thing that happened. But the research itself is actually really clear that trauma lives as much in the body as it does in the mind. And recent studies have actually started to show that trauma can reshape things like posture and muscle tone and, the way that the body actually holds itself in space. And there's been several, meta-analyses and what I like to call nerd shit over the last couple of years that have found that people with trauma histories will carry more tension, have more instability, and more signs of what they call chronic autonomic activation. And they do this long after the event is over. Now, let me go back to something. Chronic autonomic activation is just a really long, fancy way of saying when the body gets stuck in fight, flight, or freeze. And so if you have a smart wearable that measures stress, you might know what I'm about to talk about here. So I used to have a smartwatch. I don't anymore, partially because of this. And, several years ago, when I would look at my smartwatch, it had this stress reading. And literally, from the moment I would wake up until the moment I went to sleep, with the exception of when I was actually doing exercise, it looked like a bear was chasing me all day. All day. My stress level was crazy high. Okay. And it wasn't like I wasn't actually feeling stress. My mind and my personality wasn't measuring or thinking that I was super stressed out, but my body, my physiological system, my autonomic nervous system was like, oh my gosh, we are running, we are going. In fact, the only time that it stopped doing that was when I actually went and worked out hard, went for a run or something like that. And when I did that more consistently, it's almost as if it reset the scales, because my body was like, oh yes, we're really stressed, a bear is chasing us. And then when I would go for a run, it's like, no, this is what it feels like, if you do sprints or something like that as part of intervals, you're like, no, this is what it feels like when a bear is chasing you. And then it could kind of start to reset. But I thought that was so fascinating. So if you have ever looked at your smartwatch and thought, this thing's not working, it says I'm super stressed all the time, it could be that you actually are in this state of chronic autonomic activation. So might be worth talking to somebody about to see if that's actually what's going on. It can also impact digestion. So a lot of trauma survivors tend to have higher instances of digestive issues. And then, of course, I'm not going to say most importantly, but this is probably most relevant to my work, is that it can definitely show up in sexual desire. So again, it's really cool to be in this career field now because so much research within the past couple of years has been able to confirm really what so many of my clients already know and have known in their bodies and with their bodies, that trauma can disrupt arousal, it can squish desire, and it can create distress where intimacy is actually meant to bring connection. And so when we say that trauma doesn't just live in memories, that's not that's not being cute, and that's not speaking metaphorically. That's quite literally what we're talking about. The science tells us that trauma embeds itself into all of these things, and it can embed itself in digestion and desire, and it can become a pattern that the body rehearses, sometimes for years, until something interrupts that loop. So when we feel stuck or disconnected, it's often because the body is trying to finish this conversation, if you will, that the mind is not going to let it have. And for my work, a lot of healing begins when we can stop asking, like, what's wrong with me? And, you know, switch to a different question, which is, what is my body trying to say? And for what it's worth, sometimes the most radical forms of self-care is just simply noticing, like, where do I feel clenched right now? Where am I holding back? And the ultimate question for so many of my folks, which is, what is it that I don't want to feel right now? What am I actively aware that I am trying not to feel? And when you can understand that trauma lives in the body, here's the other thing, something else becomes clear. What becomes clear is that the body is always communicating with us, and not just through pain or contraction, but also through expansion as well. So think about it this way. If trauma teaches the body to brace, then something else can teach the body to expand. And what is that something? Well, I would argue that the opposite of trauma is actually pleasure. And that this is one of those sensations that often gets treated like it's frivolous or decorative. And don't get me wrong, like, it can be. But for the next few minutes, I actually really want to talk about it in, arguably the least sexy way possible. We're going to look at it. We're going to look at pleasure like a biological cue. And once again, you can blame neuroscience for just stripping the sexiness out of this, but I think it's actually really important. So you may recognize this name, especially if you're a nerd and you are kind of obsessed with the nervous system. Maybe it's just me, but Stephen Porges, as well as some others, have done some really cool research that shows that experiences of pleasure activate the parasympathetic pathways that signal safety. In other words, pleasure is actually one of the body's ways of saying, I'm safe enough to soften here. I can expand. Ooh, I like this. And actually that understanding kind of signaled a turning point in my journey, because when I was working primarily as a trauma therapist, I watched clients graduate from treatment the moment their PTSD symptoms were considered, quote unquote, resolved. Their nightmares were better and their panic had eased and their bodies weren't in like constant defense mode. But for many of them, they still couldn't enjoy sex. And they couldn't tolerate closeness, and their bodies really didn't know how to experience pleasure without fear, or not at all. It was just kind of numb. And yet we discharged them because the symptoms were gone. But the truth is, like, their aliveness really hadn't returned. And I remember thinking, like, this really can't be where healing ends. Ask anyone who has been through some serious shit in their lives, and they will tell you that managing distress is not enough. It's like the bare minimum. And yeah, it lets you keep going, but there's got to be a way. This is where I was at. I was like, there's got to be a way for people to feel safe enough to enjoy and connect. And that's kind of how I got to where I was going, because we tend to think about, if somebody is traumatized, then they are beneath their baseline, right? They're lower in their functioning. And then the goal of PTSD therapy, trauma therapy, is to get them back to their neutral pre-existing baseline, which Freud called neutral misery. But like, that's not good enough. And we know that post-traumatic growth exists. And so I think I have always been somebody who wanted a little bit more and was like, hey, I I don't think that we should just get people back to neutral. I think we can get people to a place where we're either restoring something actively pleasurable, or let's face it, sometimes people don't have a healthy relationship with their body even before trauma happens. And so can we get them even better than when they started, which is literally the definition of post-traumatic growth. And, it took a minute, but I think I was finally able to argue with myself enough to say sex therapy is something worth pursuing, because not doing that, it's having a greater impact. It's not just harming my clients to not be able to experience pleasure, but it's also doing harm to my clients' relationships and to their partners. And that whole, what I just described, again, when the opportunity came about to become a sex therapist, I was like, I got to do this, because healing can't stop at survival. There has to be a way to include the capacity for pleasure and the ability to feel expansion and curiosity and desire and presence, which brings us here, which is to the place where I get to say, pleasure is not a luxury, it is information. And reclaiming pleasure is not about indulgence. It's about the body saying, my aliveness matters and I get to feel this. Pleasure is not a luxury, it's information. And when you experience pleasure, your nervous system learns, I'm safe, I can expand. But let's be honest, for many women, pleasure has been pathologized, politicized, or at minimum pushed aside. And for so many of us, we can perform desire, but we don't necessarily inhabit it, and we chase productivity while at the same time starving our senses. What I'd like to invite you to consider is that reclaiming pleasure isn't about indulgence. It's actually about integrity. It's about saying, my aliveness matters. And for what it's worth, sensuality isn't always sexual. It's the art of being awake to the world. Think about it. It's like the taste of ripe fruit, or the warmth of sunlight, or in my current setting, a space heater humming beside me that I'm hoping you can't hear. It's the slow inhale before you speak truth. Before we go any further, I want to take a moment to say something about how I hold science and information in this space. One of the reasons why I wanted to start this podcast in the first place is because I have grown weary of hearing opinions presented as fact, especially online. I'll often hear very confident claims and catch myself thinking, ooh, where did that come from? And sometimes the science is real, but it's been stripped of context or source for the sake of brevity. I mean, there's only so much you can stick into a couple minutes. Sometimes it's been really oversimplified, and sometimes, quite frankly, it's just not true at all. And in an age of widespread disinformation, and where everyone is rewarded for sounding like an authority, it becomes harder to tell the difference. So here's how I approach it. What I share on the Intimate Philosopher is informed by peer-reviewed research, clinical experience, and of course, lived observation. But it's not offered as universal truth or an instruction manual. Neuroscience and psychology give us powerful lenses to view the world and our experiences, but no single study or framework can capture the full complexity of the human body, or relationships, or how trauma or desire is going to show up in each individual person. And so when I interpret research, I try to do so thoughtfully, and I want to show my sources whenever possible, and you'll be able to find them in the show notes. You are 100% fully invited to question what you hear, explore the research for yourself, and take only what feels true for you. This isn't a space for certainty. It is a space for community, inquiry, discernment, and most of all, honest conversation. I think that we can't have this conversation without also acknowledging that there's some work to do around healing the mind-body divide. So historically, we've been taught to trust the mind, logic, cognition, certainty more than the body, and to analyze instead of feel. And that has been woven deeply into patriarchal structures. I mean, girls are told that they're emotional, boys are told that they're rational, and the body becomes something suspicious in that sense instead of wise. But the truth is, we need both. We need the mind to make meaning from the signals that are coming from the body, and the mind can't heal what the body hasn't felt safe enough to release. So in that case, somatic healing isn't about fixing. It's about creating enough safety for sensation to surface. And that might mean crying, shaking, laughing, or sighing. I mean, the body really actually does know how to complete this cycle. Our job is to simply listen without judgment. And when we can do that, something really beautiful happens. We end up remembering that pleasure and pain aren't opposites. They're both ways that the body says, I'm alive. So I want to pause here. I want you to take a few minutes to notice something. Your body has actually never stopped talking to you. In sensations, in tensions, in the places that you go numb. It's been carrying all of the weight of what you've lived through and also the possibility of what you haven't yet allowed yourself to feel. Healing the mind-body divide, one thing it's not about forcing yourself to do somatic work that you're not ready for. It's about beginning to relate to your body less as a problem to solve and more as a partner in information. And in our next episode, we're really going to zoom in on one specific kind of information that the body gives us, which is pleasure, and specifically how women are taught to distrust it and what erotic intelligence really means and how to build a relationship with desire that feels safe and grounded and deeply your own. For now, just notice, where in your body do you feel even the tiniest bit more awareness than you did when we started? And then let that be enough for today, right? Let it be enough. It's good. You're good. You're great, actually. And I'm so glad you're here. So until next time, for part 2, I'll see you soon. Thank you so much for joining me for this after hours conversation. If something in today's episode made you pause, get curious, or see yourself a little more clearly, share it with a friend and keep that conversation going. Until next time, keep exploring that messy, beautiful space between meaning and being human. I'll see you next time.